This is incredible. How many people do we have here? Every time I come, it seems like there's more and more people that are here. I heard backstage that there's 7,000 of you here. 7,000. You know, some of you know the story that when I was first getting into this research on happiness, my father, who's a neuroscientist at Baylor, sat me down and he said, Shawn, the average scientific journal article is only read by 7 people total, which is incredibly depressing for a researcher to hear because I know that that statistic includes my mom. So, but that's 7 people. I guarantee that there's a place right now where 3 or 4 researchers are gathered around a brain scan and they're learning something and they're like, man, I wish people knew about this. And I wish they could see this. I wish they could see that there's a room of 7,000 people taking this research and bringing it to life. It's amazing. I've loved getting to sit backstage and to learn from Amber and from David, and I feel like there's so much richness that you've probably already been inundated with all these incredible ways in which you could be changing your life and be thinking about things you should be doing right now. And it just made me realize how much of a privilege it is to get to be here. And I want to thank you so much for this. You know, as I was walking around, as I've been here a couple of times to speak with Miriam, actually some of you might not know this yet, but this has been an incredible year for me. Earlier this year, I got married. To Michelle Wheeler, which some of you know, and the other exciting news is we're pregnant. We have a little baby boy due on February 14th on Valentine's Day, which we cannot wait for. But she wishes that she could be here to say hello to everyone. But you know, part of it, by the way, what I'm here to talk about is I'm here to talk about the new research in my new book, Before Happiness. But when I was backstage talking to Jeff, he said, no, you're not gonna get to go out on stage unless you tell the story about Amy, because we have 3,000 new people that are here that have no idea who I am, and more importantly, don't know who Amy is. So let me tell you that story very briefly, but it's actually going to fit right into the discussion we're going to have today about the research that's been coming out that really changes everything about what we were thinking about what creating levels of happiness. So if you know this story, you can help me tell it. But when I first got in, I started this academic research when I was just 7. So if any of you have children and they're 7 and they're not doing academic research, you're clearly not pushing them hard enough. But when I was 7 and my sister was 5 years old, I was 2 years older than my sister at the time, and we were playing up on top, and I'm 2 years older than her now, but at the time, we were playing up on top of these bunk beds. How many of you had bunk beds growing up? A lot of you. I loved them. I would still have them now if they were socially acceptable. But on one side of the bunk bed, I had we were going to play war. My sister was younger than me, so she had to do whatever I wanted to do. And on one side of the bunk bed, we had all my G.I. Joe soldiers and weaponry lined up. And on her side, she had all of her My Little Ponies and unicorns lined up for this cavalry charge. And I wasn't concerned about what would happen. I had won this war every single time we had played in the past. If I was losing, the rules of engagement would change. But there were differing accounts of what happened that afternoon, but since my sister was not invited to come speak with Miriam today, you get to hear the true story. Which is my sister is a little bit on the clumsy side, and somehow without any help or push from her loving older brother at all, suddenly Amy disappeared off of the top of the bunk bed and landed with this crash on the floor, and I nervously peered over the side of the bed to see what had befallen my fallen sister. I saw that she landed painfully on her hands and knees on all fours on the ground. Now I was nervous because my parents had charged me with making sure that my sister and I played as safely and as quietly as possible. And seeing as how I had accidentally broken Amy's arm just 1 week before this. Don't take her side, most of you don't even know her. when I was trying as hard as I could to be on my best behavior, and I saw on my sister's face this wail of pain and suffering and surprise, threatening to erupt from her mouth and threatening to wake my parents from the long winter's nap for which they had just settled. So I did the only thing that my little frantic 7-year-old brain could think to do to avert this tragedy. And if you have children, you've seen this hundreds of times before. I said, Amy, wait, please, please, please don't cry. Did you see how you landed? No human lands on all fours like that. She stopped mid-cry with confusion on her face and looked up at me, and I had no idea where else this was going. That was the extent of my strategy. So I blurted out the only other thing I could think of, which is, Amy, I think you're a unicorn. We've got some unicorns back there. I love it. Let me tell you, it was cheating. Because there's nothing in the world my sister would want more at that moment. To not be Amy, the hurt 5-year-old little sister, but Amy, the special unicorn. Of course, an option that was open to her brain at no point in the past. And you could see on my poor, manipulated sister's face conflict. As her brain attempted to devote resources to feeling the pain and suffering and surprise she'd experienced falling off this bunk bed, or contemplating this newfound identity on the other side. And that side won out. Instead of crying, instead of ceasing our play, instead of waking my parents with all the negative consequences that were about to ensue for me, instead a smile spread across her face, and she bounded right back up onto the bunk bed with all the grace of a baby unicorn. With one broken leg. What we had stumbled across at that tender age of 5 and 7 is exactly what I want to talk to you about today. What we had stumbled across is a new field in psychology that Jeff and Amber have been promulgating throughout all of the not only the work that you've been doing, but throughout all, you can hear it, the messages of it, weaving through all the speakers you've heard today. Positive psychology, instead of studying what's broken about the world, instead of studying just depression disorder, what we started to study were things like compassion, as you just heard with Big Brothers, Big Sisters, or hope, or love, or happiness. Now, we think immediately, well, you can't study something like happiness, right? But why can we study depression and not happiness? Why can we just study the negative but not the positive? What we started realizing was we actually could study it. And by studying it, we could see how much you could change. And what I got fascinated by is what I want to talk to you about today. My previous book, and if you've been in previous events and heard me, you've heard me speak about the happiness advantage. And in that book, what I had people do is, in the research I was describing, what I saw initially at Harvard. I spent 12 years at Harvard and watched these students get into a school that they wanted to go to, and then 80% of them, instead of feeling happy, 80% of them, in the midst of their success, went through work-debilitating depression. And actually 10% of Harvard students contemplate suicide over the previous year. That's heartbreaking. People with so much potential losing the connection to meaning in their life. And what we started to realize was this was not about Harvard students, it's about every single human brain in the world as we contemplate the connection between happiness and success. And here's what we found. If we raise your success rates for the rest of your life, your levels of happiness will flatline. You will experience no greater levels of happiness just because of an increase in success in your life. And you heard David mention this as well. Part of what we found is that if we flipped around the formula, if we raised levels of happiness in the present, if we could find some way of getting people to bring this research to life, to deepen their social connections, to become more optimistic, to be different from their genes, then what we could do is we could raise every single success rate possible, every business and educational outcome, and improve our health outcomes and ripple it out to other people. Raise your success rates, happiness remains exactly the same. But if you really want to cultivate success, you actually have to start with creating a positive brain. That was the happiness advantage. What I want to talk to you about today is what happens before happiness. Because as I've been speaking to Neora, as I've been speaking to groups worldwide, I've worked now with in 50 countries and working with over a third of the Fortune 100 companies. And what we found was that people would hear this research and some of them would immediately go and do something with it. They would change the way that they interacted with their families. They would change the way that they would interact at work. And then there are other people who would hear this and they wouldn't change. And the question was, why? Why wouldn't people change if they had all this incredible information at their disposal? What we started to realize was before you can make a change to your happiness, before you can cultivate success, before we can change our health, your brain has already constructed a picture of reality, which predicts whether or not you'll be successful. What I want to talk about is how we can look at the reality in which you're currently looking at the world, the reality that you're constructing, and how can we change it so that you can see how much change is possible. Because all of this research comes down to this one conclusion, is that change is possible at any point in your life. As Amber was talking earlier, I resonated so much with the things that she was saying about the silencer, about that there's parts of our life that say you can't actually do that. You know, one of the things that's interesting is as I came in last night into the hotel, I saw several of you who came up to me and said hello, and you were like, oh, it's the happiness guy, and what I realized was that it's oftentimes it's a lot of it's not responsibility. I can't think of the right word right now, but like it's a lot of pressure sometimes to be the happiness guy all the time. Right? I wonder if like people who win like a Nobel Peace Prize get into problems with their spouses. They're like, oh, good job, Mr. Nobel Peace Prize. And so I think what I realized was what a privilege it is to be here. Not only the fact that we get to take this research that only is read by 7 people at a time and bring it to life, but part of what I'm excited about is this idea that I even get to do this with you, that I get to talk about happiness. Because when I mentioned that Michelle is pregnant right now, but one of the things that we actually haven't told many people is that part of the reason that it took us a while to tell people that she was actually pregnant was we lost a baby 2 months in. And I had to leave right after that to go give a talk on happiness at a bank. And I remember sitting there thinking about how difficult this was. Or I gave a talk on happiness on Boylston Street 2 days in Boston, 2 days after the Boston bombing, when the streets were cordoned off, and my talk was on positive leadership. And what I realized was that it's very difficult sometimes for us to, you can hear, as Amber was saying, that silencer, saying, who are you to talk about happiness? But we get it at both times. When things are going well for you, of course you can talk about happiness. And you maybe get that as well. When you're positive, people are like, well, of course you're positive. Look what's going on in your life. And then when bad things happen, well, you can't talk about happiness then either, right? Because how can we talk about happiness in the midst of loss, which many of you might be experiencing right now, or in grief? When I got into this research that I'm about to talk to you about, I was at Harvard, and I was just telling Michelle the story. I had never even told her the story before. It just popped back into my brain. But I went through 2 years of depression while I was at Harvard. And during those 2 years of depression is different for everyone. But for me, it was like I wandered out into a swamp, and I couldn't remember how I got there. But more importantly, I couldn't remember why I wanted to get out of that swamp. Why would I exercise? Why would I do gratitudes? Why would I do anything if my behavior doesn't matter? I remember walking across the street on Massachusetts Avenue in Boston, right outside of Harvard, and there was this bus that was coming, and I crossed in a place where there wasn't a crosswalk. I was trying to get to class. And I remember, as I was walking there, I didn't actually speed up for this bus that didn't see me, that was going very quickly, because I just didn't care anymore. And I remember writing in a journal saying, I don't remember being happy, and I don't think I'll ever be happy again. That was my first journal entry. I think there's moments in our life, which I believe we can have here over the next hour and while you're here at this conference, where there are these moments where you actually wish you could go back and be able to say, do you have any idea how much life could change from this point? I wish I could have talked to that boy who was walking across the street, who didn't care if he got hit by a bus, to say, someday you're going to be talking to people about the science of happiness. Because I think that could be all of us. And the reason I see this as a privilege, and I'm going a little bit off my talk, but this is so important, the reason I see this as a privilege is I'm a placeholder for you. What we're realizing is you have the ability to make these types of changes in your life and to be these beacons of people who are sharing this positive research with other people. And Jeff has been talking about this, about how through the Live Happy magazine and through the spreading of this positive psychology research, that you can actually start to tell other people about this research and be able to, even in the midst of the challenges you currently feel, even in the midst of the stresses we feel within our lives, maybe there's bad things have gone on in your life, but that you could be the person who's actually leading this movement like you see Jeff and Amber doing. And for me, to get to be part of that is an absolute thrill. So from that boy that was walking across the street to now, I just want to thank Miriam so much for this opportunity. So let me tell you, you cannot change your happiness. That was the conclusion that science would have told you a few years ago. If I had been in front of you and I was speaking about research, I would have told you what we learned based upon studying twins. We looked at twins up in Minnesota, and we found that if you have identical twins and you raise them apart, they were already going to be raised apart. We didn't do that for the study, but you take identical twins and you raise them apart. You've got the same genes, different environments, and this researcher found that on average, 80% of the happiness of those twins was based upon their genes. So he, and I believe most people that are not in this room believe that. I believe most of our friends back home, I believe most of the people within this world believe that we're mostly just our genes. Some people are born happy, some people are born pessimist. That if you're really positive after you come back from an Neora event, well, yeah, you're just one of those people that was just born positive, that's how they do it, right? That is not the, well, if you believe that, which I believe most people believe, you have to believe the next statement, which is stop trying to change your happiness. You're as likely to be able to change your happiness as to change your height, which is the conclusion in the quote that famous researcher said. Because 80% of our height is determined based on our genes, and if that's true for happiness, then stop trying to change it. He's since recanted that statement, because it turns out that he was only half right, which in this case I believe makes him fully wrong. We are born, when my child is born, when my baby boy is born in February, we 3 days later can shine a light at it, and we plan on it. Shine a light at it, and doing a click, and if our baby turns towards it, it turns out that that baby at age 10 is more likely to become an extrovert, is trying to increase its neocortical arousal. If it turns away from it, it's actually trying to decrease its neocortical arousal, and it's probably going to be an introvert. That's day 3, we haven't even had time to screw it up yet. Everyone in here was born with different genes for obesity, for optimism, for pessimism, for alcoholism. But that's only the beginning of the story. It's the beginning of the story, but it also, for most people, for the average person, is the end of the story. The average person doesn't fight their genes. As we saw, and as you heard from Amber, where you push and you start to feel like things are uncomfortable, that's you pushing against what your genes and your environment actually give you. But the research I'm about to talk about shows how much we can actually change based upon our genes, our childhood, the environment around us to actually become more positive, and in doing so, create a reality that we can spread back to other people, causing us to not only become happier, but to reap that happiness advantage, where every single business and educational and health outcome improve dramatically. In order to tell you about that research, I want to tell you about one of the studies that I was involved with initially. My father, who I mentioned earlier, is a neuroscientist at Baylor. This is him about my age, looking at half of a brain. And my mom was pregnant, he actually hooked my mom up to an EEG machine to see if he could test the brainwave patterns of me in utero. It was the first time that this was ever tried, and it failed miserably, which he says something about my brain, not the equipment. But afterwards, I started realizing, so because my dad was a psychologist at Baylor, all of our babysitters actually came from his psychology classes, and I fell in love with all of them. And so, at first I thought things were going great. I had a date like almost every Friday and Saturday night. But things were going as well as I'd hoped. For example, my parents were paying the girls at the end of the night, which is not a good indication of a date. And so I realized that I really need to find some way of being able to become part of their world, which was a strategy I learned watching Ariel and the Little Mermaid. And so I decided that I would participate in one of my dad's psychology experiments. And he was so excited about letting me be part of one of his psychology experiments, he didn't even think about whether or not I had ulterior motives. And I did. Her name was Heather, and Sarah, and Allison. And so I went up on that day, it was the day my dad was doing the brainwave experiment. And what he does is you take these electrodes with electrode jelly and you stick them on the scalp. And what it does is EEGs detect the electrical impulses that occur within your synapses as your brain is constructing a picture of the world. And you can show those brainwave patterns to other people and be able to analyze them. So he was hooking me up and I was all excited. Things seemed to be going very well. All my girlfriends were smiling at me. And then my dad was so excited, he made one small mistake, which is he forgot to ground the wire on the EEG machine. So in front of all my girlfriends, I basically was sitting in an electric chair getting shocked. And I don't blame my dad for shocking me. I do blame him for laughing. And I pulled off all the electrodes and stomped off to the side of the room. I was like, Dad, thanks for ruining my chances with all my girlfriends, and then left the room, which only made things worse. But part of what we were studying, the reason I wanted to bring you back to that memory is as we were studying the brain, we discovered some incredible things. My father was at UC Irvine studying these things. When he hooked up my mom to that EEG machine, 30 years later, that same research was going in a vein where we were able to actually peek behind the veil of what your brain is doing right now, what your brain is doing as you're constructing pictures of the world. In fact, using more advanced machinery, they got a grant from the military where they can put an EEG helmet on you. And as you're thinking thoughts, as you're thinking words, you can even think of syllables like ka and ba. It can detect what words you're thinking. It's called imagined speech, and then be able to put those words into earpieces of people that are on a battlefield, in a fire situation, without even having to transmit anything out loud. We can literally read your thoughts, which is phenomenal. It's actually, I think, coming out on the iPhone 6, which we're so excited about. It's called synthetic telepathy. And what it's allowed us to do is actually figure out what you're doing as you're constructing pictures of the world. And what we found were there are certain types of people that were not just happier, but they had actually trained their brain to become what we now call positive genius. It's not about emotional intelligence or IQ or even social intelligence. It's before all that happens, your brain constructs a picture of the world in which change is either possible or not. What I'd like to talk about is how do we change our brain from our genes and actually make it so that as we leave this room and we go out, we don't have to be just our genes or our environment, but we can actually be a different person with a different brain and cause other people to have that experience as well. So part of what we got interested in as we were doing this is by the way, called evoked potential. What we're looking for is the potential that's embedded within inside each of the brains as we're doing this. I've already set up the equipment for our son, which Michelle has already hid from me. But part of what I'm so excited about is being able to detect these things as we're looking at the world. Here's what we found. This is phenomenal. At the University of Virginia, they were studying soldiers. They were looking at hills around them. And there's a story about two soldiers in Afghanistan. They were being pursued by enemy combatants, and they were looking up at a hill where there was a helicopter extraction point. As they were looking up at this hill, which was a 600-foot hill, the first soldier, as he looked up at it, tired, fatigued, and negative at this point, and frightened, he looked up at that hill, and his brain judged it to be a 900-foot hill, which was actually too tall for them to be able to climb in time. Now, here's the interesting part about this. His brain didn't say, I think it looks like a 900-foot hill. His brain showed him a picture of a 900-foot hill instead of a 600-foot hill to his brain as he was processing this. As he looked up at it, he just knew he couldn't climb it in time, and he just sat down, knelt down, waiting for the pursuit to catch up with him. The other soldier looked up at the hill, and her brain actually saw it as a 600-foot hill. She was actually part of the reason that she was good at being a soldier was her ability in the midst of challenges to quiet the noise and be able to see reality for what it actually was. She saw a 600-foot hill, which was actually potentially something that they could climb. So then her brain started looking for paths to success up the mountainside, which she saw one. Her brain then dropped neurochemicals called success accelerants into their system, which got her ready to be able to climb that. And she quieted the noise of the enemy pursuit, and she then told her partner, we can climb that hill. Got him to get up, and they actually made it to the helicopter extraction site. Which is phenomenal. What's amazing about this story is we do that all the time. We do that all the time as we're looking at the world. All of us, and part of the study, what they found is, as I look at hills in front of me, where I'm carrying weights, if I'm in a negative state of mind, that hill actually looks significantly steeper, and that weights feel heavier. We are all carrying around weights. We are all facing challenges that are in front of us. But what our brain decides to show us predicts whether or not we think change is possible. What I'd like to do is to talk about how can we actually change our brains, because positive geniuses are able to go through exactly that pattern. And in the new book, part of what I do is go through each of those 5 steps we just mentioned. First of all, how do you recognize that there are multiple realities? How do you map a path to success? How do you quiet the noise within your life? How do you release these success accelerants? And how do you then, my favorite part, create positive inception? Get other people to start creating that positive change, to start to believe that positive reality around them. We're going to go through little bits of each one of those today, because I think it fits in so well with all the things you've been hearing so far today. So this is based upon an initial idea, and actually somebody, when I was waiting at the to check into my hotel, actually mentioned this idea, which I'm so glad is starting to catch on because I love it. Part of what we found was that when most people are thinking about the world, they're like, oh, you're an optimist or you're a pessimist, right? So you've got a half-full glass of water or a half-empty glass of water. And everyone's so focused upon, should I put on rose-colored glasses to see this as half-full, or is this really half-empty and there's nothing I can do with this in my life? Positive geniuses don't even waste time with that game. We don't care if the glass is half full or half empty. If you take one step back and start to realize that there's actually a pitcher of water that's sitting on the table. What we want you to do is to do exactly that. We don't want to look optimistically or pessimistically at what's going on within your life. What we're looking for is there a pitcher of water to fill up the glass that you have right now and to start helping fill up the glasses of the people around you. And what we believe can help you fill that up is the research that we're about to talk about. Positive genius is the ability to continually architect successful realities and positive realities, but only based upon true facts. I gave a talk to a group of CEOs out in Northern California, and after the talk, one of these CEOs of these top software companies offered to drive me to the airport afterwards to talk about his company. And I was so thrilled. I got into his really nice car and put on my seatbelt, and he got in on the other side of his nice car, and the same car, and he immediately started talking to me about his company, and that little bell was going off in his car, and I was like, it stopped going off, and I was like, you don't wear seatbelts? And he said, no, Shawn, I listened to your talk, I love your research, I'm an optimist. I was like, no, you're an idiot. Optimism's great for a lot of things. It doesn't stop cars from hitting us. It doesn't stop reality from impinging upon us. That's irrational optimism. What I'd love to talk to you is how we can create rational optimism. In order to do that, I'd love to do a brief experiment with you. This is not the smiling experiment we did in the past. This is a separate experiment that shows you exactly the lens through which we view our world. So here's what I'd like you to do. What we found is that at Yale Medical School, we found that if we could take doctors out of the laboratory and into an art museum and get them to look at art, their likelihood of seeing important medical details rises by 20%, which is extraordinary. Now, 26 schools have started taking doctors out of the lab, out of the hospitals, and taking them into art museums to teach them perspective. Because by changing their perspective, teaching them how to do this, taking them to show them art, by cross-training their brain, it turns out they get much more successful at seeing challenges and ways that they can change their life. What I'd like to do is a brief experiment with you. This is called a thematic apperception test, these are actually really fun, but they're incredibly powerful. What I'd love for you to do is to partner up with the person that Amber partnered you up with just a few minutes ago. And here's what I'd like you to do. I'm going to show you a picture. I'm going to show you a picture, and in this picture, what I'd love for you to do is within 30 seconds, or actually within 10 seconds, as you're looking at this picture, I want you to think of and describe with as much detail in your brain the story about what's going on within this picture. I want you to tell me the story of what is actually going on in this picture. It's like what you do at airports. Michelle and I, when we're at airports sometimes, we play this game where we'll look at people walk by like couples, and we'll try and tell their story. Like, oh, they're really fighting right now, you know, because one of them loves Breaking Bad and the other one wanted to watch Nashville. And like, we've got whole stories that are going on. They're usually reflections of what Michelle and I are experiencing. So here's what I'd love for you to do, is to basically do exactly that. I want for 10 seconds for you to think of the story. This picture is actually one of the ones that's famously done in this test. And then with that partner, I'd like you to tell them your story and hear their story. Don't change any of the details of your story. So here's the first one. So for 10 seconds, think of the story with as many details as you possibly can about what's going on within this picture for 10 seconds. And then what I'm going to have you do is with your partner, I'm going to have you tell them your side of the story and then hear theirs. So ready, go. You have 45 seconds to tell your partner. So switch it up, make sure both of you have told your side of the story. Okay, we're going to do another one. I want you to do even better on this one. More details, more explanation. Use all of your brain's power to figure out what is going on in this picture. You have 10 seconds to figure out the story, and then you're going to tell it to your partner. Ready? Go. Oh, I forgot, this is slightly a racy one, but this is a famous one. All right, tell your side of the story to your partner. All right, one last one. All right, you only get 10 seconds for this one. This one's not one of the famous ones, but it's one that I added in there because I think it's helpful. Those first two are some of the famous ones for the thematic apperception test. Here's the third one. All right, so tell your partner the story with as many details as possible.
How we doing?
We're good.
All right, so do we have mic runners? Let's pick people just on the front row. I didn't get to hear anyone's, and I really want to hear some of these, so here's what I'd like you to do. We're going to go back to that first picture, and here's what I'd like you to do. Somebody on the front row, just raise your hand and tell your side of the story for what you see going on, what's the truth behind this picture you see here. Who wants to do it? Okay, we got one over there. Or do we? Who's brave enough to do this? Oh, we got one, okay.
We think this is a scared little boy. He's in the depression. His mom and dad are dead or missing. He's hungry. He has no shoes on. And he looks lonely.
Okay, so he's living alone. His parents are dead.
No, I didn't
He's in the Great Depression.
I said they're getting ready to work on
All right, let's hear one more. Anyone else want to do one? Okay.
Well, I saw the reflection, so I thought that that was water, and that he was in the New Orleans flood waiting for a boat to come by to get him.
Oh, wow.
Wow, I've never noticed the reflection. There is a reflection there, isn't there? You have no idea how many times I've looked at this picture. I never saw. That's phenomenal. So he's in the midst of a flood. Let's hear one more. Can we hear one more person with as much detail as possible? Let's see back there. Good.
I found a cricket in the dark right here. I'm holding it in my hands. And if I make it dark enough, I'll picture.
Wow, you can see a cricket? That's amazing. I love that. That's a great one. I've never heard anyone do anything like that before. Okay, good. Let's pause on that one. Let's do the second one. So who can tell me what's going on in the second picture? Or do I even want to hear people's? Maybe one there?
Okay, so they just had the most rockin' awesome sex of their lives. She died. Wait, there's more. He is feeling totally guilty, and he's also feeling the mixed emotion of, I may never have this amazing sex again.
I think we've all been there. That's a great one. All right, let's hear another one. All right, great.
This is the image from a 19th century medical journal trying to advertise the new mechanical treatment for hysteria that was in vogue at the time.
Wow, that's really good. That's great. Okay, let's do one more.
If you're under the age of 18, please cover your ears. I'm just kidding. He's a door-to-door dictionary salesman. You can see there on the table.
That's good.
He came to the door, he says, I'm here to change your life. And she says, I've heard it all. And he's read the dictionary to her, every single word to sell her. There's no third-party tools here. And what happened was, she died of boredom because there were no third-party tools.
That's genius. All right, let's do the last picture. Who's willing to do this one? That was great, thank you. Oh, we got one here?
This was a test. This was set up by a number of behavioral psychologists. And they had all those German shepherds ordered to sit. And then the cat or the kitten was sent out to stroll in front of them, which taught them that the cat had more power than all those German shepherds.
Who was saying that one? I couldn't see where that was coming from. Somebody over here. Okay. Do you have cats? Or dogs? You have cats? I'm not surprised. That's a cat lover's version of what's going on here. The cat has more power than the dog. We know cats have more power than humans, but now it's more than dogs too. I love that. That's a great one. All right, let's do one here.
Okay, so the cat is the fearless commander leading the German shepherds into battle. So he's pacing back and forth, giving them a pep talk, telling them how they're going to do it, the plan of attack, and he's going to tell them when to attack.
I love that. That's a great one to you. Any other ones that are good? They're separate from this? All right, we'll do one last one.
Okay, so there's a man on the opposite side of the cat, and this is a training process, and the trained dogs, the ones that are properly trained, don't realize that that is a cat and are still looking at the trainer on the opposite side, and the ones that did realize it was a cat are looking at the cat.
So So this is about to go poorly for that cat. I like that version too. Let's do one more over there. There's somebody excited about it. Yeah.
The cat is like, you're in training and there's absolutely nothing you can do. It's kind of walking there very proudly. Neater, 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 you can't get me. See ya, here's my tail. Smell me, bye.
That one had dialogue. That's good. So here's what I love about these. What's interesting is if you actually do about 10 of these, each individual one in and of itself actually tells us very little. But what we find is that as you do 10 of these, what we find is you actually start telling the same stories over and over again. What we do is we look through the words that you use, and we can do this actually on Twitter, on Facebook as well, but we can look through the words that you use, and we actually look for words that are need for power, need for attention, need for intimacy. And we see them happen over and over again. We tried this one other time in Miriam, and one woman was talking about how the boy that was sitting in the cabin, he was upset because he was left alone by his 5 sisters who were off all getting to go play and do other things. What's amazing, I asked that woman that, and she's like, yes, I have 5 siblings. What you see is, it turns out, as we're looking at these pictures, it turns out, while it looks like we're looking at different pictures, different things that are going on in your life, different events each day, news events, things that are going on in your family, it turns out we've got the same lens viewing the world all the time, through the same need for power and need for attention, assumptions about what's been going on in the world. Do we believe that good things are about to happen? Do we believe that bad things always happen to us and we need to actually do something about it in the present to be able to make those changes? One of the other experiments we do is a very simple one. We ask people, if you walk into a bank, there are 5 people in the bank. You walk into a bank, let's say there are 50 other people in the bank. A robber walks in, fires his weapon once, and you're shot in the left arm. If this happened to you and you're describing it to somebody else here in Miriam, would you have described this event honestly as a lucky and fortunate event, getting shot in a bank, an unfortunate or unlucky experience, or no luck or no fortune involved? I'm not going to ask you because you've been primed all day and you will answer completely different from everyone else. What we find is 70% of people say that this is a very unlucky and unfortunate experience. And the reasons are, they're like, Shawn, what's the problem here? You got shot in the arm. You know, like no one's like, well, I hope tomorrow's as good as today. Right? You got shot, you wouldn't expect to get shot when you walked into that bank. So it's a surprising event. If you get shot every time you walk into your bank, you should switch banks. Actually, my favorite response to this I got on Wall Street. One of the guys told me, he said, there are 50 other people in the bank. Surely somebody deserved it more than I did. Which in that case, I'm not sure is the case. But here's what is fascinating. So some people, 20 to 25% of people say that it's actually a lucky or fortunate experience. We ask them why. And the reasons are, you got shot in the left arm. That's 3 inches from your heart. I could have been shot in the heart, right? But instead I got shot in my arm, I'm fine. Or I'm right-handed, right? Or I get the day off from work. Or I've got a great story to tell at the bar afterwards, right? One of my favorite ones I heard was that people said that thank goodness it was them and not some older person or a child that got shot, because they can take it. Now here's what's interesting. In each one of those experiments, we take the exact same event. And what we found is the same exact event with different lenses causes some people to feel paralysis. They feel constantly afraid of what's going on in their life. And some people feel activation. They're like, wow, even though something that other people might see as a bad thing happened to me, I see my life as a privilege. I have a whole new lease on life because I didn't die in this bank. I actually am alive. And I can go off and do these things and I'll heal from this event. What we want to do is start to train people's brains to start to see those things. And we saw this in one of my favorite advertisements I saw. It was an advertisement with 3 panels. And on these 3 panels, how many people have seen this? The HSBC is the one that did it. And they have the same picture, but with a different word. And the word makes you look at the picture completely differently. It looks like a soldier, it looks like somebody who's done it for stylish reasons, or somebody who's survival. And you think about that person in a different way. It turns out that when people watch you walk back and come back from this conference, they write words in their brain about you. They think words about who you are, and it happens in every conversation. When you're talking to a barista, you're picking up high self-confidence, or introvert, or smiley, or positive, or negative, or jealous. Whatever the word is that you're thinking about in each one of those moments, your brain constructs a whole picture of reality around that person. So much so that we found that we could change it. We actually found that if you consciously think of the words you want people to think about when you return from this conference, when you walk into a room, if you're thinking, positive or optimistic or confident, all of those types of things, it turns out when we ask people around you, after you've been conscious of it, they write down the adjective that you picked, which is amazing. You can actually change other people's lenses for how they view you by consciously thinking about the words that you want. The reason for that is that you actually act in a different way, just as we perceive the world in a different way. But we started to do this with other things. One of the things we found is we started to take things that we normally think about as negative, like an overflowing inbox, an email inbox is too big. Most people say, I hate my inbox, it's soul training, it's way too much. We actually got people to do this experiment that you can do. It's similar to the gratitude experiment that we've talked about in the past, and that Jeff and Amber have been having you do. What we had people do is to think about a negative event, something that seems negative in your life, like an email inbox, and then for 1 minute, think of every descriptor you can. You get 1 point for all the negative descriptors, and 3 points for all the positive ones. We have people do this with email inboxes, and what we normally get is this. These are the most frequent ones. We get people saying overloaded, source of stress. Then you get people saying things like, well, it's also an opportunity for connection, or key to job success, or invitation for lunches, or amazingly fast, dopamine rush, or record of victories. Then when we ask them about what's going on in their day and what they don't like, they say things like, I hate my inbox, it's overloaded and a source of stress. All of these words are true, but we pick words and then architect an entire reality around them. If we could pick different words, it turns out our engagement levels, our speed at going through the inbox, our likelihood of connecting with other people deepens dramatically. So what we wanted to do is get people to, first of all, realize that there are multiple realities all the time. We argue with people to try and tell them that we've got the right reality. There are multiple realities all the time. The real question is, which is the most adaptive reality? And if we could pick one that made us see things in a different way, here's one of the ones that was most eye-opening for me when we did this, is we asked people about something like dirty dishes in the sink. So we asked people about dirty, everyone's like, oh, I hate dirty dishes in the sink. It's a chore, it's soul draining, I'd rather die, all these types of things come out. But then you get some really interesting ones. You get people saying things like, it's an opportunity to win points with the spouse. It's an opportunity to show love to somebody in your family. It's an opportunity to feel productive. After I do the dishes, I'm like, man, what else could I do? Look, it literally takes me 3 to 5 minutes to do, but as soon as it's done, I'm like, wow, I've got control of my life for a little bit. It's productive. But here's the interesting point. Once you get people to realize that there are multiple realities, you then want to keep picking that one to describe it. So as I describe the dishes in the sink, instead of thinking about it as a chore or hateful or soul draining, what we do is we start thinking about it as an opportunity to win points with the spouse. And you train your brain to do that. And what happens is, the lens in which you view the world changes, and not only do you start enjoying something as onerous as cleaning dishes in the sink, but you actually feel like you're spreading love or creating more positivity with those actions. So what we have people do is to practice this over and over again to see that there are multiple realities. And as we did this, we started realizing that our reality was predicted by a lot of things. One of the things we found is that if you don't sleep 7 to 8 hours a night, if we have you memorize negative words and positive words, after 8 hours of sleeping, you remember 70%, 24 hours later, 70% of the positive words and 70% of the negative words. Sleep less than 6 hours and come back and try to remember those words, you remember 70% of the negative and 20% of the positive. Your reality is constantly in flux. It's hard to be positive when our brain's resources don't even allow us to do this. There's a study that came out that was printed in the New York Times, and they actually found that before lunch, judges grant paroles 60% less than they do right after lunch. So if you're a criminal, you want to be there after lunch. Some of you are like, that's good advice. What's happening is that, and you've probably heard these before, but this was so helpful for me, there's 4 things that get in the way of creating your positive reality, 4 big buckets. It spells out HALT. It's hunger, anger, loneliness, and being tired. Hunger, anger, loneliness, and being tired. Whenever I'm struggling to create that positive reality, those are one of the big things that's usually coming up. When President Obama asked President Clinton about what's the one thing that, when he asked him for advice, President Clinton said, the biggest mistakes I make were when I was not sleeping. That was a big advice. The very first thing, that's the President of the United States, his first thing was make sure you're sleeping. It wasn't anything else about foreign policy or domestic or how you do. No, just make sure you're sleeping. The reason for that is because it's very difficult to create a positive reality when our brains don't have the resources necessary to do that, and we just keep seeing 900-foot hills instead of 600-foot hills. So one of the ways you can actually start to change that is with the people that are here. David talked about those accountability partners. What I want to do is to use those accountability partners doing something else as well, is doing something called a 3-person check. If you want to see if your reality makes sense, you want to check it with some other people. You want to see if that reality you're talking about is actually a valid one. So ask 3 different people. Somebody who has a different personality than you. If you're a nervous person, you ask somebody who's confident or positive. If you are an introvert, you ask somebody who's an extrovert. And ask them if you're making the right decisions on what you're most focused upon. Another one is you ask somebody in a different socioeconomic class. If you don't have much money, you ask somebody who actually is really well off. If you're well off, you ask somebody who's not, and see if your perspective is right where it should be. And then the third one is to find somebody either of a different age or a different culture. You can do either one. If you find somebody, you can triangulate the truth to figure out if your reality is actually the accurate one. Oh, I love this. Sorry, this picture, I love this picture because oftentimes we set irrational goals for ourselves. And I love this one. It's a rhinoceros that's running with a poster of a unicorn on the wall, which oftentimes we do sometimes with our vision boards, right? We create vision boards with celebrities or people that have all this money or wealth or incredibly skinny bodies, and we're like, that's who I want to be. No, you should be a rhinoceros, but you should be the best rhinoceros you should be, right? And what we found is you can triangulate the truth about what you could be or what you should be, but you don't want to put those upper limits on your potential, which we're about to talk about in a second. One of the things we talk about is how do we cancel the noise. In order, when you leave here, you're going to be, as you've been flooded with information, you've been flooded with all this positive information. You're hearing the signal that's information that moves you forward over and over again. But as Amber mentioned, you can also start to hear a lot of noise when you leave here. And that noise is anything that distracts you from believing that your behavior matters and tells you that a 600-foot hill is actually a 900-foot hill. There's both internal noise and external noise. External noise, one of the things we've been doing is we've gotten people to do a 5% experiment. And I would love for everyone in here to try this out. The 5% experiment is very simple. You just try and cancel the external noise that's coming into your brain by 5% by doing some simple things. That could be turning off the radio when you first get in the car with your kids for the first 5 minutes, or making sure there are blocks of time for 2 or 3 hours during the week where you don't check your phones or don't check your computers at all. Some people is not watching local news at all, just turning off. How many people have stopped watching the local news? If you want the news, part of what we found was that you can do it online where you can pick the stories. Right? If you go online, you can actually pick what you read, and you're voting for what stories you want to hear about. I'm so grateful that there are things like Live Happy that are pumping out this positive information all the time, but most of it, we actually have to actively cancel the noise. Now, there's internal noise as well, and that's the silencer that Amber was talking about. And what we have people do is, if you're worrying, for example, if your thought is, I can't be successful, I can't change, I need to worry all the time, we have people think 3 opposite thoughts. It actually cancels the noise, just like noise canceling headphones work, and turn your brain into a noise canceling headphone. And these 3 things were so helpful for me when I was worrying about things as well. The first one was, I'll keep my worry in proportion to the likelihood of the event. If there's a 1% chance of this actually happening, I'm only going to worry about it for 1% of the time, not 99% of it. I will not ruin 10,000 days of being a pessimist to be right on 1. If pessimists are going to be right at some point, and then they're validated for it, and then they keep worrying, and keep worrying, and keep worrying. But if we decide that we're not going to ruin 10,000 days to be right on that 1, it helps us cancel out noise. And the last one is most important, I think, for me, and especially as I'm about to have a kid, is I will not equate worrying with love, or being loving, or being responsible. When we have people do this, they're able to slowly start to cancel noise in their life and get back to that signal, which is, this is a 600-foot hill. And I believe there's multiple realities, but I'm going to pick the one that's most positive. The last thing I want to mention, and I'm finished with my time here today, is I want to talk about how we can speed towards the changes you've been talking about. Part of what I'm doing is walking you through each of these 5 steps only to serve as an introduction to the Before Happiness book, which I hope that by the next time we meet, many of you have read, so that you can actually see how it fits onto not only the happiness advantage, But you'll hear how it's the research validating the slight edge, which I love. But Dr. Hull was somebody who, like all of us, experienced difficult times in our life. Today I started with the idea that I've been through depression. I've been through, we've been through miscarriages, all of us have been through difficult times of our life, or sickness, and you probably are thinking about those things right now. This guy experienced everything. He went through extreme poverty. He got every disease possible when he was little. He got polio. He couldn't afford braces, so he had to make metal braces himself. It took him 10 years to get his PhD, which at the time should have taken much less than that. But then, in the 1930s and 40s, he dominated academia. 70% of all academic research quoted this guy, because what he had to do was he had to look for small little rules, small patterns about human life, that if he did them, it would make him successful. One of the things he found was from rats. He found that if you watched rats in a maze, they'd run much faster at the end of the maze. So we timed it and made sure that was actually the case. Fast forward to the future, the place in the marathon where people experience the highest amount of heart attacks is 26.1 miles into the marathon. They actually call it the X spot, and they put medics right there because they know it's going to happen. Right before you see the end of the race, right before you see the finish line, your brain drops all these neurochemical accelerants to speed you towards believing your behavior matters. You see the progress you've made, and you see how close that goal is to yourself. We don't want people to have heart attacks, but what we want people to do is to see, first of all, how much progress they've made. And I think that's the crucial part that I want to leave you with, is you've heard so many things about how you could change your life, but please start with how much you've already created progress within your life. Because what we found is so important. The reason for that is, for me, I write checklists. Sometimes if I'm getting overwhelmed at 10:30 in the morning, I'm like, okay, my brain's getting overwhelmed. I would write down all the things I have to do during the course of the day. I'm actually decelerating my brain when I do that sometimes, because I'm starting at 10:30 in the day. What we have people do is, after they make this checklist, they write down things they've been doing all morning. At lunch with my kid, or breakfast with my kids, I talked to a client on the way into work. I got to see this beautiful sunset. They check off, or sunrise, they check things off on their list. So they have 4 or 5 things checked off even before 10:30. That progress is actually key to finishing the rest of the checklist. We accelerate towards it. Our brain accelerates in 2 places. When we see progress, and we see how close the goal is. You've heard from everyone today how close the goal is, but I want you to remind yourself of how far you've come. Just as I mentioned that I walked in front of that bus, look how far we can come. Think of the things you've experienced, and now you're here at this event talking about the science of happiness, and hearing research that we don't get to talk about very often, and finding ways to change your life. Don't forget about all those incredible things that moved you to that point. So every time you create a new goal, every time you have a task list, every time you set new goals for donations you want to give, always start with the progress you've made in the past, because that's what propels you to believe you can learn new things in school that semester, or to make changes in your life, or do something different with this year. All of this information comes down to the 3 major conclusions that we always talk about. Scientifically, happiness can be a choice. You are not just your genes and your environment if you fight them. The second is that happiness is an advantage. If you raise your levels of happiness, not only can you see reality for it is, and be able to climb those 600-foot hills, but it turns out every single business and educational outcome improves. And when we become more positive, it turns out we're able to ripple those positive effects out to other people as well. So part of what we want us to do is to take this research, it's only read by 7 people on average, and bring it to life. But think about how this research is dovetailing with what you've heard from Jeff, and the slight edge about small little changes will lead us to greater positive changes in the future. And that when we're positive, we can actually tip the world around us. What we found is if we can tip people to positive, we can increase the number of sources of people who are positive. And social influence is 3 things: the strength of our message, the immediacy of our message, and the number of sources. We have 7,000 people here who are all spreading this message, and for me, this is one of the greatest privileges ever of getting to share this research with you. I'm going to be around all this evening, so I'm looking forward to getting to talk to you more, but thank you so much for the opportunity to share this research.